So I was asked to give a history of Hawaiian-focused charter schools, and I like to think of this, as just one mo'olelo, just one genealogy. There are many ways to tell these stories. And my particular way into the story is really through my involvement with Halau Kumana, engaging with the community, the beautiful community that started the school, and getting to network with other beautiful communities throughout the Pai'aina that started their own schools. My son is practicing his oli for makariki right here next to me, so hopefully that's not too loud for you folks. Good track background. So I will get right into this genealogical mo'olelo and build on the awesome talks that Noelani and Kahele gave in the previous weeks that I got to watch. So one of the main things that I kind of want to take away from the first part of this is that public education is a Hawaiian national legacy. The public school system was built under the laws of a Kanaka-led government, an independent, internationally recognized one at that. And for the majority of, for the entirety of the time, up until the beginning of the US occupation, Kanaka Maoli made up the majority of teachers in the kingdom in public schools during that period. It's also certainly the case that schooling wasn't forcefully imposed, but that our kupuna really embraced learning of all kinds, and learning to read and learning in school settings was one of those contexts. At the heights of early enrollments in the 1830s, there were about 1,000 schools here in Hawaii, and these were predominantly schools for, at that time, adults. But compare this, and the population of that time, obviously much, much smaller, was as compared to how many public schools there are today in Hawaii, about 287, even though we have, far, far more people today. Hold on just a second. So as you probably know, the first codification of public schooling that institutionalizes our national public school system is in 1841 under the reign of Kauai Keaoli, who declares also he aupuni palapala ko'u, that his government is one that promotes literacy, the use of various forms of reading and writing. And the Haina Luna graduates around this time begin going into schools to become teachers. And so the teaching force, as I said, from that time, and even from the early days of as Kanaka were first learning how to read, prior to the beginning of public schools being created, the vast majority of the teachers were Kanaka. So if you look at governance, of that period, public school governance at the time at all levels were Kanaka in the kingdom. And sorry, going too fast here. At the various levels, Kahele talked about this in her talk, that the what we would now think of as the superintendent, the Luna, David Malo, and then the kahukula, the island level leaders, all Kanaka who were appointed. And then you had these local school boards, and these were very much community driven boards that were running and caring for the schools. And so what did these local school boards do? What were some of their powers? You can see here in 1852, you had in Hawaii 535 public schools, again, far more than currently, who were under the control of the parents interested, taught predominantly by Hawaiians in Hawaiian and serving about 15,000 students. So some of the powers that these local school boards had were power over the budgets for their schools, the hiring and firing of kumu, the building and maintaining of schoolhouses. There was a poll tax that had been instituted to fund local schools, and then assuring that their keiki were attending school. And I should also say that in addition to the hiring and firing, there was also just the caring for, more importantly, and even the feeding of kumu by the boards and the families who were part of these school communities. So they were organizing themselves, the haumana, and their ohana to really malamala aina so that they could provide food for kumu, which I think is such a beautiful thing. Yeah, we shouldn't just be giving our kumu goodies to eat at the holiday season, but really, you know, always giving back and providing for the people who take care of our keiki from a day to day. So in 1893, you have this major breakage that, again, the other speakers in the previous weeks also talked about, which was not only the usurpation of the national government and the national lands, but also the usurpation of the Hawaiian national public education system. And this is something that has major consequences, just like the usurpation of control of our lands does. And there's this rising, right, white supremacist oligarchy that comes to power, really installs themselves in power beginning in the late 1880s, and of course, you know, then with US military backing, seizes control of the government. And they had this fundamental challenge, right? How do you control a population where the vast majority of the people are the people that you believe are inferior to yourself, right? The Kanaka, the Asian settlers, immigrants who had come from the plantations, how were they going to maintain that? And a huge part of maintaining that was the control of the school system. So this is just one small, well, two small examples here. Yeah, one is a cartoon example of kind of what imperial schooling was sort of envisioned as, right? The great white father teaching, and you see on the bench here, you know, peoples representing the different territories that were illegally seized in 1898. But also in terms of what the actual structure and budgeting looked like for public education, that you see this increase in enrollment in the public schools in the early decades of the territorial era, predominantly Asian, an influx of Asian students, and yet the budget isn't in anywhere near increase in kind to the way that the system is growing. And so you had this growing gap, right, between the what we now know today as the public schools and the private schools. So fast forward to getting us to Hawaiian charter schools, because, you know, I start with that part of the history because charter schools don't emerge out of nowhere. Hawaiian charter schools don't emerge out of nowhere. We're very much tied to this long history of Kanaka communities wanting to have control over the schools which their keiki are learning. And that system being taken and the way that it's utilized, really entrenching these deep hierarchies, racialized, gendered class hierarchies. So by the early 1980s, there were some really important studies that were done at that time, and we are all probably very familiar with the statistics, but in general, what these early studies on Native Hawaiian health and Native Hawaiian education found was that Kanaka Maoli had at that time the highest rates of family poverty, incarceration, being pushed out of schools, various negative health indicators, including suicide, depression, substance abuse, you name it, right? And so what we found when we get to the early 2000s and just before, when all the Hawaiian charter schools are born, or many of them, most of them are born, is that those rates were really largely unchanged, even though there had been some amazing advances in Hawaiian educational programming, the birth of Hawaiian language immersion education, various kinds of programs that really did important work of creating space again for our cultural knowledges and practices. What we were seeing though is that these, untenable in our view, in many of our view, statistics were unchanged. And I have to say, sadly, that in 2020s, they're similarly, still incredibly problematic, right? So you have at this point, at the turn of the 21st century, the intersection of these two movements, the Hawaiian movement on one side, and I say that in broad and loose terms, and a US-based charter school movement, again, sort of in broad and loose terms. These are internally complex movements, right? But these two distinct movements kind of converge. They have different ethical imperatives, different philosophies, but out of that convergence is how Hawaiian-focused charter schools come into being. So on one side, you have these Hawaiian movements of Aloha Aina and Ea, and Haunani-Ke Trask writes about the birth of the Hawaiian movement, the modern Hawaiian movement, coming in 1970 around land struggles against evictions. You also had water struggles, like the struggles for water in Waiahole and Maui and everywhere. Language revitalization, right? Cultural practices like the hokulea being born, and then all of that also becoming articulated as a need for political power. So those movements that were pushing for all of these various ways that Kanaka needed to be able to exercise our ea, create the conditions of possibility out of which Hawaiian charter schools can emerge. And as I'll show in a little bit, charter schools had direct connections to these broader movements that were about, but also beyond education. Oh gosh, let me know if I pause. I just got a note that my internet is unstable. On the other side, you have these charter school and choice movements in the US as one form of school reform. And the literature on the US charter school movement talks about the ways that this is a very politically diverse movement. There were, from the early days, people on various ends of the political spectrum who were arguing for charter schools, often not recognized, but another, really important kind of history of the need for autonomous schools are the freedom schools that were started out of Black liberation movement, and as well as the survival schools and other autonomous schools that Native American communities were founding in the era of really articulating red power. But this idea of charters in particular is often credited to this guy named Ray Budd, and it's really the idea that these really massive urban school districts that were unwieldy and bureaucratic and huge and impersonal could be restructured by allowing groups of teachers to apply for and receive charters, right, agreements, contracts that would allow them to explore innovative approaches and, importantly, to have a limited form of self-governance. And that's really what's at the crux of charters, is the governance piece. It's not, it's a particular kind of vehicle, right, for exercising all different kinds of pedagogical philosophies or ways of budgeting and resourcing. But it's really that governance piece that is what makes it a charter. So similar kinds of reform get kind of implemented in various parts of the US, and then it becomes, by the 1990s, really the largest and fastest aspect of this growing school choice kind of idea. And, there are really damaging ways in which that played out in various other states, where you have for-profit entities, for example, being able to really erode the public school systems by creating these opportunities for charter schools. That is not what happened in Hawaii. The story of charter schools in Hawaii is a very different story because of the movement as that really intersects, as the very strong public sector unions like HSTA and the HDEA really oppose and help in some ways put this sort of check on. And from the experience of those of us who started schools at that time, I have to say it wasn't felt as a supportive, but I think that in the bigger scope of things, the fact that we had that kind of check on what the limits were of charter schools actually was helpful in various respects when you look at what's happening in other states. So the law in Hawaii included a cap on the number of charter schools. It provided for only a single authorizing authority, which was originally the Board of Education itself, and that's obviously problematic in certain ways, but it wasn't sort of wide open. It also made sure that the collective bargaining agreements applied to charter school employees, while also giving the local charter school boards the ability to negotiate supplemental agreements to those the existing CBAs. The other thing it did was it provided a baseline for inequitable funding, which is obviously not a good thing. And in particular, no provision for facilities or capital improvement, which has proved to be continuing, ongoing, long-term struggle for many of the schools. So why do we have the situation where we are in Hawaii, where half of the schools are controlled by predominantly indigenous communities? We have to give a huge amount of the credit to these two people, Ku Kakalau and Nale Kakalau, who did an amazing amount of outreach and support for all of the Hawaiian communities that applied for charters right after the passage of the 1999 law. And what they were kind of expressing to us, that it's not the answer, it's a vehicle. And right at that moment, it was the best vehicle of the time. So it wasn't the purpose, it wasn't the vision, it was one way to get to our bigger vision. And what they highlighted, and many of us were involved with starting Hawaiian culture-based schools or Hawaiian immersion charter schools, noted is that the Hawaii DOE is the most centralized system, right, under the US, with a single Board of Education governing the whole district. So schools that are vastly different across very different kinds of communities and geographies, with different kinds of cultural and community-based resources, just couldn't be governed by a single board system, that was as totally out of step with kind of a more AINA-based focus on education. And of course, as we talked about, vast disparities in that system that were just untenable. And the racial hierarchies, when you looked at who comprises student body still in the DOE and who comprises the majority of the teaching force and the administrative and governing officials, it's not reflective of who the students are, right? So these untenable conditions, really lead, Kuenale had started a Hawaiian culture and language immersion camp they held in Waipi'o Valley in relation to work that they were doing at Honoka'a High School. And out of that, once the law passes to allow for startup charter schools, they become the first school, Kanoe Cadina becomes the first school to get its charter. And that 1999 law was pretty important because it allowed for startups, where the previous laws had allowed for conversion schools. But who did you see convert? You saw Lanikai, Naʻauao, and Waihona, which are great schools, but they are in predominantly upper middle class, white or Asian neighborhood. They were not Kanaka controlled in any way, shape, or form. And so the opportunity to start new schools from scratch was really important in allowing and creating that space. So, when you think about who were some of the people that started these schools, again, there are just absolutely directions to Hawaiian movement, right? So I mentioned the Waihole struggle for water. You have the Ho'ohana, Uncle Calvin, Auntie Charlene Ho starting Hakipu'u Learning Center. The Edith Kanakaʻole Foundation, here, Auntie Pua, Kanakaʻole Kanahele. You see, her and their family having been involved from the earliest days of the Kaho'olawe struggle in the 1970s. You had people like Makalapua Alancaster and Kauanoe Kamana, who were founding directors of Kamakau and Navahi, respectively, who were part of the birthing of the Ahapunana Leo and Hawaiian language revitalization movement. For the first time, you had Ni'ihau communities, not just one, but two schools, Kanaka and Kikula Ni'ihau o Kekaha, and of course, Waihona o Naʻauao out there on the Waihona side. So these are, some of the kind of direct connections and ways that the movement was impacting and utilizing the beginning of this law to create spaces for educational autonomy, or semi-autonomy, I should say. And Ku points out, that it was a major factor here was that 25 years roughly had passed between the 1978 Con, which creates this constitutional mandate that the state of Hawaii should provide for Hawaiian education. And as she says, nearly 25 years after the passage of that, there was still not even the basic minimum. So it was the idea that, look, the state has put into its own law this mandate and has done very, very little about it. And so the idea for charter schools was, we want to have that control to do it ourselves. And I thought this was a really important line to highlight. And this comes out of Dr. Kahakalau's dissertation, where she says, this would allow us to have that kind of like curricular and pedagogical autonomy and flexibility. At the same time, Department of Education funding would give us long-term stability and assure that all our employees would be state employees with union wages and full benefits. So from the very beginning, the people who were starting these schools didn't just have in mind they wanted autonomy, and we didn't think of ourselves as, employers per se. But what we thought was really important was that our people who are doing a lot of this educational labor basically for free or at very low pay in like the kupuna program in the DOE should be getting paid at wages that are pegged to the HSTA pay scale. That they should be able to make a living doing this work. So that's really important. I just wanted to highlight that. The other thing that I think is understudied and perhaps underemphasized is the way that these charter schools have not, Hawaiian-focused charter schools in particular, have not only created a space of learning for the haumana, but have also created a space of learning and growth and development for the kumu, for the teachers who are union members and be able to make a living as teachers, and being able to share, right, the ike that they probably would have found other ways to share anyway, but maybe not for pay or not as a day-to-day job. So some of these people have really been able to grow into like amazing leaders, and I think that's something that should really be looked at further is the ways that these schools have been and can continue to be even more sort of training grounds and pu'uhonua, right, in a sense, for kumu who are developing and growing and have so much to give. So these are just a few people that I'll recognize, and then I'm wrapping up. And these are just folks primarily from Halau Kumana, because I wanted to recognize the people who had worked at the school for many, many years. And also our sister school, which is no longer in existence, Halau Kahi, was a long time a powerful kumu at Kahi, as well as in the bottom corner, Kalani Kalima, who was one of the leaders at the Hunana Niho actions in 2019 and also ran for city council. From Halau Kumana at the top here, you have our kumuhula for the first 20 years of our existence was Kumu Kavika Mersburg. On the top right corner, Captain Bani Kahapea, who is captain of Kanehunamoku, and Kanehunamoku was actually born out of the same birth as what birthed the school. It was a grant really that gave us the funding to do that. But she's been able to start a nonprofit entity that does exclusively va'a education out of that. You have Mai Kane at the bottom left, Imai Kaleni Winchester, and right next to him, Kalele Hua Maioho, who has been on many occasions the HSTA rep for Halau Kumana. And they're among the longest running teachers at the school. And then I also wanted to just give a shout out and recognize Maya Chong, who's giving that PowerPoint on the top level. She's a kumu at Kanoe Cadina, has been doing some really amazing thinking and planning around organizing kumu from Hawaiian-focused schools to think about how to do labor organizing in a culturally grounded way, and how to engage with school leaders, the employer, in ways that are consistent with building community and culture. So I just wanted to recognize that work and to say that there are kumu out there who are thinking about how to do this great work of making sure that the working conditions of teachers are healthy and sustainable so that they can continue to do this work into the long run. And with that, I'll say mahalo and pass it on, and hopefully we can talk story and